You were never supposed to figure this out. The system wasn't built for you to win. It was built for you to participate, to show up, to contribute your energy, your hours, your best years, and then disappear quietly when you're no longer useful. And the cruelest part? Most people never even question it. They wake up, they grind, they sleep, they repeat, and somewhere deep inside they carry this quiet ache, this feeling that no matter how hard they push, the finish line keeps moving. That's not a coincidence. That's architecture. The wealthy don't talk about this. Not at dinner parties, not in interviews, not in the books they publish for mass consumption. They talk about passion, about hustle, about believing in yourself. And while you're busy believing, they're busy positioning. While you're busy grinding, they're busy engineering. There are two games being played simultaneously in this world. One is visible, the other is not. And until you see the invisible game, you will keep losing the visible one. Niccolò Machiavelli understood human nature in a way that made him dangerous, so dangerous that his name became synonymous with ruthlessness, with manipulation, with moral corruption. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Machiavelli wasn't a villain. He was a realist. He looked at the world not as it should be, but as it actually is. And he wrote down what he saw with terrifying precision. The powerful use his principles every single day. The powerless call those principles evil, because it's easier to reject a truth than to absorb it. What you're about to hear is not motivation. Motivation is a drug, a short-term chemical rush that fades before Monday morning. What this is a framework, cold, precise, and deeply uncomfortable. Because real knowledge always is. The moment you understand how wealth actually moves in this world, you cannot unsee it. You'll look at your employer differently. You'll look at advertising differently. You'll look at banks, governments, social media, and the entire structure of modern civilization differently. And that shift in perception is worth more than any salary raise you could ever negotiate. Let's begin where Machiavelli himself began, with human nature, not the version we're taught to believe in, the noble, rational, fair human being who rewards effort and punishes dishonesty. No, the real human being, the one who is emotional before logical, tribal before individual, comfort-seeking before truth-seeking, the one who responds to fear more powerfully than to reason, who follows narrative more faithfully than evidence, and who will sacrifice long-term security for short-term relief almost every single time. This is not an insult. This is a map. And if you refuse to read the map because it offends you, you will stay lost. Machiavelli wrote that men are driven by two primary forces, love and fear, and that fear is the more reliable anchor. He wasn't celebrating cruelty, he was observing physics, emotional physics. The same way gravity pulls objects downward regardless of whether you believe in it, fear shapes human behavior regardless of whether it's acknowledged. The wealthy understand this. They build entire industries around it. Insurance companies sell you fear. Pharmaceutical companies sell you fear. News networks sell you fear. And in each case, fear is the product and your money is the price of relief. Every time you pay to feel safe, someone positioned above you grows wealthier. This is not evil. It is leverage. And leverage is the first secret principle you must internalize if you ever want to stop being someone else's resource and start becoming someone who controls resources. Think about the last time you made a major financial decision driven by fear. Maybe it was keeping a job you despised because you were afraid of uncertainty. Maybe it was buying something you didn't need because you were afraid of missing out. Maybe it was avoiding an investment because you were afraid of losing. In each of those moments, your fear was someone else's profit. Your hesitation funded someone else's expansion. Your paralysis was their momentum. Machiavelli observed something that cuts directly to the heart of wealth creation. He said that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. Read that again slowly. Men are so ready to obey present necessities, meaning people are so consumed by the urgency of right now, by the pressure of rent, of bills, of social expectations, of hunger, that they can be moved almost effortlessly by anyone who understands how to use that urgency. This is why payday loans exist. This is why fast fashion exists. This is why every subscription service on the planet buries the cancellation button 6 pages deep. They are not selling you products. They are harvesting your present necessity. The first step toward escaping this trap is not earning more money. It is developing the awareness to see the trap itself. Because the trap is invisible to those inside it. It looks like normal life. It looks like Tuesday morning. It looks like convenience and comfort and just this one time. The wealthy have a different relationship with urgency than the poor. Not because they are more disciplined in some moralistic sense, but because they have been taught or they have discovered that urgency itself is manufactured. And manufactured urgency can be observed, can be dissected, and can be refused. This refusal is the beginning of power. When you stop reacting and start observing, something shifts. You stop being a participant in someone else's economy and you start being a student of it. And a student eventually becomes a practitioner. A practitioner eventually becomes the one teaching, and the one teaching is never the one paying. Now let's go deeper, because understanding that you're being played is only the first movement. The second movement is understanding the mechanism of the play itself. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the nature of the prince, the leader, the one who holds power. But what he was really describing, stripped of its historical context, was the psychology of the person who sits above the system rather than inside it. And that psychology is built on a single foundation: the ability to see people as they are rather than as they wish to appear. Most people show you a performance. They perform competence, perform loyalty, perform friendship, perform contentment. And if you watch the performance and believe it, you will be managed by it. You will make decisions based on illusions. But the person who watches the performance and sees behind it, who reads the anxiety beneath the confidence, the calculation beneath the generosity, the agenda beneath the small talk, that person holds an extraordinary advantage. Not because they are cynical, but because they are accurate. Wealth begins in perception, not in bank accounts, not in investments, not in property, in perception. Specifically, in your ability to perceive reality more clearly than those around you. Because every financial opportunity that has ever existed was invisible to most people before it was obvious to everyone. And by the time it becomes obvious to everyone, the profit has already been extracted by the few who saw it first. This is not luck, this is not genius, it is a trained habit of perception. The habit of watching the world without the filter of what you wish it were. Machiavelli himself was a close observer of the Medici family, one of the most powerful banking dynasties in the history of Western civilization. The Medici didn't rise because they were the most virtuous. They rose because they understood something the merchants and the nobles and the clergy around them did not. They understood that money is not a reward. Money is a tool, and like any tool, its power depends entirely on the hand that holds it and the mind that directs that hand. You have been trained from birth to think of money as a reward. You do good work, you receive payment. You provide value, you receive compensation. This is the story of money that keeps workers working and keeps the structure of every economy in the world stable. It is a useful story for those who benefit from your labor. It is a catastrophic story for you, because the moment you believe money is a reward, you trap yourself in a posture of waiting to be recognized, waiting to be promoted, waiting for your effort to be noticed, and the world is full of extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily hard-working people who waited their entire lives and received, at the end of that waiting, a modest pension and a quiet death. Money is not a reward. Money is a current. It flows. It moves constantly, ceaselessly, from one hand to another, from one account to another, from one nation to another. And like any current, it follows the path of least resistance toward the structures that are built to receive it. The wealthy don't earn money. They build channels. They construct systems, relationships, positions, and narratives that redirect the current toward themselves. And while they're building channels, the rest of the world is standing in the river with cupped hands, catching whatever drops happen to splash their way. This is the law of positioning. and it is perhaps the most ruthlessly honest principle Machiavelli ever implied, even when he was writing about politics rather than economics. He understood that the prince who controls the fortress controls the territory. The one who holds the high ground dictates the terms of every engagement. And in the economy of the modern world, high ground is not geographic, it is structural. It is the position you occupy in relation to the flow of value. Are you the one creating value for someone else's system, or are you the one who owns the system through which other people's value flows? The landlord and the tenant produce no different amount of human effort in a given day. In fact, the tenant may work far harder physically. But the landlord sits at the junction point where the tenant's need for shelter intersects with the landlord's ownership of shelter. And at that junction, money flows upward automatically, month after month, year after year, regardless of whether the landlord is working, sleeping, or on vacation in a country you've never been able to afford to visit. This is not injustice in the emotional sense, though you are free to feel that it is. In the Machiavellian sense, it is simply geometry, the geometry of position. Now, the question that should be burning in your mind is this: how do you change your position? How do you move from inside the system to above it? And here is where most wealth advice fails you completely. Because most wealth advice tells you to save more, invest in index funds, cut your coffee spending, develop a morning routine, all of which is the equivalent of telling someone drowning in the ocean to improve their swimming technique. Technically accurate. Practically insufficient. You don't need better swimming technique, you need a boat. And a boat is built from understanding, not from discipline alone. The first thing you must understand about changing your position is that it requires a complete psychological reconstruction, not a motivational upgrade, not a mindset shift in the shallow sense of that overused phrase, a reconstruction. Because your current psychology was not built by you, it was built for you, by schools that trained you to follow instructions and call it education, by employers who trained you to equate busyness with productivity, by a consumer culture that trained you to convert every increase in income into an increase in spending so that your net position never actually changes, by a financial system that profits from your confusion and calls that confusion complexity. Machiavelli wrote that the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, and the inverse of that principle applies to you with devastating precision. The first method for estimating the financial trajectory of a person is to look at the ideas they have inside them, not their intentions, not their ambitions, their operative beliefs, the beliefs they actually live by, not the ones they post about. And the operative belief of most people, the one they live by even when they claim to want wealth, is that safety is more valuable than opportunity. Safety is the great trap. Because safety feels like wisdom. Safety feels like responsibility. Safety feels like maturity. But safety, in the economic sense, is almost always a euphemism for stagnation. The safe job keeps you employed and keeps you exactly where you are. The safe investment preserves your capital and ensures your capital never becomes leverage. The safe relationship with money, the one where you never risk, never expose yourself, never put anything on the line, is the relationship that guarantees you will always need to trade your hours for someone else's numbers on a screen. The wealthy are not reckless. Understand that clearly. Recklessness and strategic risk are entirely different things. Recklessness is gambling. Strategic risk is positioning. The wealthy assess the geometry of a situation with cold precision. They ask not will this work, but what is my position if it works, and what is my position if it doesn't? And they only enter situations where even the downside leaves them in a position of learning, of connection, of future leverage. This is why the wealthy can fail multiple times and still accumulate. Because failure for someone with the right positioning is education. Failure for someone without positioning is catastrophe. Machiavelli understood this distinction in political terms. He wrote that a prince must not have any objective other than war, nor any thought other than the art of war and its discipline, for that is the only art that is of concern to one who commands. Now strip that of its martial context and hear what he is actually saying. The person who holds power must be entirely devoted to the study of how power works, not to ethics, not to reputation, not to being liked, but to the mechanics of power itself. And in the modern world, the mechanics of power are the mechanics of wealth. Because in a world where violence is largely outsourced to governments, money is the primary instrument through which human beings command other human beings. This sounds dark, and it is dark. But darkness is not the same as wrongness. The night is dark, and yet it exists. The ocean is cold, and yet fish thrive in it. The economic reality of human civilization is that money is power, and power is not distributed fairly. It is distributed strategically. And if you want to participate in that distribution differently than you currently do, you need to study the strategy, not resent it. Here is where we arrive at one of the most practically powerful principles Machiavelli ever articulated, the principle of perceived strength. He wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. And while this is often quoted as a piece of social brutality, its application to wealth is far more nuanced and far more useful. In the economy, fear and love translate into something very specific. They translate into perceived value. The entity, whether a person, a brand, a company, or an idea that is perceived as irreplaceable, commands a completely different economic relationship than the entity that is perceived as abundant. Think about what happens when you are easily replaceable at your job. Your employer knows it. You know it. And that shared knowledge sets the terms of your compensation with brutal efficiency. You are paid exactly enough to keep you from leaving and not $1 more. Because why would they pay more? The market is full of people who can do what you do. You are abundant. Abundance destroys leverage. But the moment you become perceived as scarce, as the only person who understands this particular system, who has this particular relationship, who carries this particular capability, the entire negotiation inverts. Now they need you more than you need them. And that inversion is worth more than any raise you could ask for. Scarcity is the engine of economic power. And the Machiavellian insight is that scarcity does not have to be real. It only has to be perceived. This is not a suggestion to deceive. It is an observation about how value is actually determined in human markets. Value is not objective. It is not determined by how hard you worked or how talented you are or how much you deserve recognition. Value is determined by perception, by narrative, by the story that exists in the minds of the people who might pay for what you offer. And the person who understands this stops waiting to be discovered and starts deliberately crafting their perception. This is what personal branding actually is at its most ruthless level. It is not vanity. It is not performance for its own sake. It is the deliberate management of how you are perceived by the people whose perception determines your economic position. Every decision about what you share, how you appear, what you associate yourself with, what you refuse to associate yourself with, is a decision about your perceived value in the marketplace of human attention and human resources. Machiavelli was the first great theorist of image management. He wrote that everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are, and those few dare not oppose themselves to the opinion of the many. That sentence alone contains more practical wealth strategy than most business school curricula. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Your appearance, in every sense of that word, is your public economy. It is the surface through which the world decides what you are worth, what opportunities to offer you, what rooms to invite you into, what conversations to include you in. And the tragic waste is that most people manage their appearance by accident, by habit, by social default, rather than by intention. The wealthy manage their appearance with the same precision they apply to their financial portfolios. They understand that being seen in certain rooms matters, that being associated with certain people matters, that the story told about them in their absence is an asset that either appreciates or depreciates depending on how carefully it is cultivated. They don't leave their reputation to chance because they understand that reputation is currency, and currency that is not managed is currency that is slowly stolen. Now let's talk about something even more foundational than perception. Let's talk about information, because information asymmetry is the single most consistent source of extraordinary wealth in human history. Every great fortune, when you trace it back to its origin, rests on a moment where one person knew something that others didn't. The investor who understood the technology before the market did. The entrepreneur who saw the demographic shift before the competitors did. The banker who understood the risk before the regulators did. Information asymmetry is not luck. It is cultivated. It is the result of being positioned in places where information flows, of building relationships with people who carry knowledge, of developing the habit of asking questions that most people are too distracted or too comfortable to ask. Machiavelli himself was a master of information. As a diplomat and political secretary in Florence, he spent years in rooms where power was negotiated, where alliances were formed and broken, where the real decisions behind the public decisions were made, and what he observed in those rooms became the foundation of everything he wrote. He wasn't theorizing from a library, he was reporting from the front lines of power. And what he reported was this: the person who controls the flow of information controls the outcome of every situation that depends on that information. In modern terms, this means something very specific. Your network is not a social nicety, it is an intelligence operation. The people you know, and more importantly, the people who trust you enough to speak candidly in your presence, determine the quality of information you have access to. And the quality of your information determines the quality of your decisions. And the quality of your decisions, compounded over years and decades, determines the trajectory of your entire financial life. This is why the wealthy obsess over who they spend time with in a way that looks antisocial to those on the outside. It is not snobbery, it is strategy. Every hour spent with someone who carries information you don't have is an hour of intelligence gathering. Every hour spent in conversations that produce nothing new is an hour of stagnation, dressed as socializing. Machiavelli wrote that the wise man must always follow the paths of great men and imitate those who have been outstanding. Not because imitation is the destination, but because proximity to excellence is the fastest route to understanding what excellence actually requires. Most people learn about wealth from people who don't have it. They take financial advice from relatives who are broke, from teachers who never built anything, from media figures whose business model depends on keeping you engaged rather than educated. And then they wonder why their financial life looks like the average of all those influences, because it is. Your financial life is the average of the information, the beliefs, the habits, and the strategies of the people you learn from and spend time with. This is not metaphysical. It is mathematical. Change the inputs and you change the outputs. But changing the inputs requires something that most people find deeply uncomfortable. It requires leaving behind the social environments that feel familiar and safe in exchange for environments that feel foreign and challenging. It requires being the least knowledgeable person in the room and staying there long enough to absorb what the room knows. It requires a kind of strategic humility that has nothing to do with low self-esteem and everything to do with a clear-eyed assessment of where the knowledge you need actually lies. This brings us to one of the most practically powerful and most consistently misunderstood principles in all of Machiavellian thought, the principle of the fox and the lion. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must know how to use both the beast and the man. He must be a lion to frighten the wolves and a fox to recognize traps. Those who rely simply on the lion do not understand what they are about. In economic terms, the lion represents force, direct action, confrontation, the willingness to compete openly and aggressively. The fox represents intelligence, indirection, the ability to see traps before stepping into them, to navigate complexity without triggering resistance. Most people operate as only one of these: the aggressive entrepreneur who charges forward without reading the room and walks into traps that a moment of fox-like observation would have revealed, or the overcautious analyst who sees every trap with perfect clarity but never moves because the lion in them has been domesticated out of existence. The extraordinary wealth builders are both. They move with the patience and observational precision of the fox until the moment arrives when the lion's force is required, and then they strike without hesitation. The switching between these modes, knowing when to watch and when to act, when to negotiate and when to walk away, when to reveal strength, and when to conceal it, is itself a form of mastery that takes years to develop, but begins with the simple recognition that both modes exist and both are necessary. Now let's address something that lives at the very centre of why most people never build real wealth, even when they understand these principles intellectually. And that thing is identity. Specifically, the conflict between the identity you currently carry and the identity required to operate at the level you say you want to reach. Because you can understand leverage intellectually and still never use it. You can understand positioning and still never change your position. You can understand the law of narrative and still never craft one. If your identity, the deep operative sense of who you are and what kind of person you are, remains the identity of someone who works for money rather than someone who deploys money, all the knowledge in the world will be converted by your psychology into an action. Machiavelli understood identity in political terms. He wrote about the necessity of the prince being able to transform himself, to wear different faces in different rooms, to be merciful where mercy serves the strategy, and ruthless where ruthlessness serves it. He was not describing a psychopath. He was describing a person who has freed themselves from the tyranny of a fixed self-image. Most people's greatest financial limitation is not their bank balance. It is their self-concept, the story they tell themselves about what they are capable of, what they deserve, what kind of person engages in the behaviors required to build real wealth. That story was written for you before you were old enough to write your own. It was written by your family's relationship with money, by the economic class you grew up in, by the messages you received about what ambition looks like and whether it's admirable or suspicious, by the particular combination of encouragement and limitation that shaped your earliest understanding of what's possible for someone like you. And that story, because it was written early and reinforced constantly, feels like truth. It feels like your actual self, rather than a narrative installed by circumstance. The beginning of real financial transformation is the moment you realize those are not the same thing. You are not your economic history. You are not the sum of your family's financial patterns. You are not limited to the ceiling that your environment suggested was appropriate. But you will live as if you are until you make the conscious, uncomfortable, sustained decision to rewrite the operative story. Not through